BanjoKazooie was another of Rareware's gems on the Nintendo 64. It is more than likely the definitive 3D action platformer for the console, and takes the formula that Super Mario 64 laid down to an even higher level. Now, it is a collectathon at heart and takes the player through several fantastical worlds ranging from murky swamps to winter wonderlands and everything in between. From the game's opening and intro, it shows its heart and humor with a hilarious musical performance by most of its main characters. And it is from this first moment and throughout the entirety of the adventure that you get to see Rare's mastery in game design, especially when it comes to the audio department. Truth be told, this game boasts one of the absolute greatest soundtracks the console had to offer in its 4 to 5 year life. Each and every single world you traverse will have you humming its music well after you finish playing the game. And the gameplay is the real star in this one, as you control the tandem of Banjo and Kazooie, and each character comes into play while pulling off many of the moves in their arsenal. Speaking of moves, this is one of the notable ways in which BanjoKazooie outdoes Super Mario 64. See, in this game, you have access to many more moves and many more abilities than in the console launching predecessor. Not to mention, each world is much bigger and much more expansive than the worlds in any 3D platformer before it. Now, the gameplay is diversified due to you not only having to collect the 10 jiggies in each world, but musical notes as well. Now, you're going to want to keep an eye open for these musical notes in every single world, because they are the currency used to open many of the doors blocking your progress within Gruntilda's lair. Also, you'll also need to be on the lookout for 5 different colored Jinjos in each world, because finding them will result in you getting one of the 10 jiggies hidden in that world. Man, I really remember the huge impact that this title made when it launched. And though Rare was already established as a go-to Dream Team developer for the Nintendo 64, it was this game that in many people's eyes put them at the very top. My first playthrough of this adventure when it launched was one of the best gaming experiences I had on the console. The game scored huge with critics and reviewers as well. All these years later, and the Bird and Bear are still fan favorites, so much so that we all lost our collective minds when they were announced for Smash Bros. Ultimate. Now, another way in which this game differentiated itself from the pack of action-adventure platformers was the impact of Mumbo. He is the ally shaman of Banjo and Kazooie, and his hut resides in several of the game's worlds you explore. Now, if you have enough Mumbo tokens, Mumbo would transform our duo into different creatures, and this was always necessary for the collection of a certain Jiggy, either within the world itself or hidden in Gruntilda's lair. And yup, Mumbo tokens are another item that you will be collecting, so make sure that you keep an eye out for them. So whether we talk about the game's graphics, music, gameplay, its memorable cast of characters, its beautifully crafted worlds, it all leads us to the exact same place. And that is the inevitable conclusion that BanjoKazooie is easily one of the best 3D action-adventure platformers ever crafted by human hands. So it's no surprise to any that it has firmly landed its spot on my top 20 greatest Nintendo 64 games of all time. Rampage World Tour is midway arcade goodness brought home to everyone's favorite fun machine. There is no elaborate narrative or thought-provoking plot twists in this one. No, the premise of this game is as simple as the fun it provides the player. And that premise is simply to eat everyone and destroy everything that you see. I mean, that's really all you really need to know about this one. And yet, I couldn't get enough of this one back in its heyday. At the beginning, you have the choice of selecting from one of 3 different monsters to play as. You have George the Gorilla, you have Ralph the Wolf, or Lizzie the Lizard. Now, my favorite was always Lizzie because she reminded me more of Godzilla, and that's my favorite kaiju. And it may surprise you to learn that each of these 3 were originally human. And it's only through the chemicals from Scum Labs Inc., the game's antagonist, that they have been mutated into these gigantic beasts. And so, in a quest to absolutely wipe Scum Labs from the face of the earth, you travel through every major city in the world, wreaking havoc and eating the local population. Man, this one really was so much fun. And even though it's a good enough game played in single player, let's be honest, this type of game is begging to be played in multiplayer. You and 2 other friends will cooperate as a team to destroy every town and every scum lab that you come across. However, at the same time, you will be competing for the higher score as you can collect various point-yielding collectibles found in the very buildings you're destroying. And you can also damage each other with flying kicks, punches, and attacks of that nature. Now, one thing to note, every character has their own mega food. For example, Lizzie's is a ladybug. Now, if you collect this mega food, it's going to give you a huge point bonus, so be on the lookout for it. There are also certain hazards that are found in the buildings as you pound them into dust. Hazards such as electrical wires, stoves that set the building on fire, also engulfing the player, and certain items that if eaten will take health away and make your beast vomit. Now, the game is called Rampage World Tour because you literally go across the globe to every major city on every continent. In certain levels, there is hidden in a random building somewhere a United States flag. And every time you punch this flag, it spins and becomes another country's flag. Now, the flag it remains as is the country you will go to for the next level. Also, certain cities have what they call tourist traps. Now, these are famous landmarks that are just chock full of edible humans that will boost your health as well as your score. And every couple of levels, you'll come to what is called a bonus level. For example, you have one where it's raining people, and the objective in that one is to eat the most out of all the players. And it's in levels like this where the mayhem reaches a fever pitch as you beat the holy hell out of each other, trying to snatch up the most people you can before the time expires. And though the game could get a bit repetitive after a while, it's still great fun in small doses. It also has a sequel called Rampage Universal Tour, which takes our trio out into outer space. And though that game is great fun as well, it really was World Tour that made the big impact for me. It's just a bona fide arcade classic that I constantly go back to every time I'm in the mood for a Nintendo 64 fix. Of course, it did release on other consoles such as PlayStation, but I've always included it in my top N64 games whenever I've made a list. It's a third-party gem from a long-dead studio whose content I've always enjoyed. It's one of the funnest multiplayer experiences to be had on the console or in that generation period, and this is the criteria it has met to be included in my top 20 games of all time. Turok Dinosaur Hunter is the console's original first-person shooter. It launched in February of 1997, way before we had ever gotten GoldenEye. It was based on a comic book series and was the first proof that first-person shooters were possible on a video game console. As a matter of fact, it didn't just prove they could be done on console, it thrived on the console. It made great use of the Nintendo 64 analog stick and the console's horsepower. Now, leading up to its launch, gamers were starving for a mature-themed hardcore action title for Nintendo's console, and this game more than delivered. I mean, from the very opening level, you could see the game's amazing scope and graphical supremacy as the Lost Land was brought to life in stunning vision and detail. Now, enemies consisted of both humans and dinosaurs, and their animations were just incredible for the time. This was maybe the first game I ever played in which enemies had several different death animations. This made every experience you had playing a fresh and new one. They may get thrown back from the gunfire or hold your throat as blood squirts from their open wounds. It's really hard just to express just how mind-blowing this was for 1997. And the levels were also massive. Probably the biggest worlds I had ever explored in a first-person shooter up until that point. Now, I know GoldenEye is the masterpiece that everyone, myself included, loves, but honestly, this game had levels that absolutely dwarfed anything you'd find in GoldenEye. You really felt as if you were exploring an actual jungle or the ruins of an ancient temple. And the levels weren't just big, but they also included a lot of verticality, as Turok could climb certain walls and vines. And there was also a lot of platforming involved in the gameplay, something very rare and welcomed for a first-person shooter. Now, when it comes to weapons, all you need to know is that this game boasts one of the very best arsenal of weapons in any FPS, only being surpassed by its sequels. I mean, you got everything from bow and arrows to shotguns, rifles, grenade and rocket launchers, plasma rifles, particle accelerators, and the mighty Chronoscepter. The Chronoscepter was a weapon whose fragmented pieces you found throughout the 7 different worlds you would explore, and the Chronoscepter's construction is vital for defeating the game's final boss. Speaking of bosses, the game has 4 main bosses you will encounter throughout your adventure. All 4 are engaging and thrilling battles with some really awesome foes. The first one you battle is the Long Hunter. He uses his jeep as a barrier between you and himself, and after you destroy it, you battle him on foot, and he's quite a handful. He uses plasma rifles, and when he gets in close, he uses hand-to-hand combat. Now, you also battle a gigantic and venomous praying mantis that can fly. Wrap your head around that one if you can. There's also a cybernetic T-Rex that breathes fire and shoots you with an eye laser like Kano from Mortal Kombat. And it's really funny when the T-Rex eats you because he burps out Turok's Indian feathers. Now, the game's final boss is a Shao Kahn-looking half-human, half-machine conqueror who teleports around the stage and causes extreme damage when he connects with his club. Honestly, Turok Dinosaur Hunter is a hell of a ride from beginning to end and definitely needs to be experienced. And it's also, in most ways, the most successful FPS on the console in the sense that it spawned an entire franchise on the console. 2 mainline sequels and a multiplayer-based spin-off as well. All this and more are the reasons why it lands on my top 20 greatest Nintendo 64 games of all time. Star Wars Shadows of the Empire was a launch window title for the console back in the year 1996. It's a Star Wars title that focuses on the time period between the films The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Now, while it may not be technically the best Star Wars game, it happens to be my favorite all-time Star Wars game. In it, you play as Dash Rendar, a friend of Han Solo and fellow mercenary. And playing as someone other than a mainline character gave the studio some real freedom when creating the game's narrative. Now, the reason this is my favorite Star Wars game is in the gameplay itself. It is the only game that comes to my mind that blends 3 different playstyles together this successfully. You have on-foot missions where you control Dash and make use of his blaster. Then you also have on-rail vehicle missions where the vehicle goes on a predetermined path, leaving you able to man the turrets and fight off incoming TIE fighters. And it also has vehicle missions where you have complete control over your ship. I don't think there's anyone out there who will ever forget the first time they played the Battle of Hoth stage. Getting to control a snowspeeder in full 3D, battling against the Empire's probe droids, AT-STs, and AT-ATs was a dream come true for all Star Wars fans everywhere. And having to actually harpoon the AT-ATs and fly around them with a tow cable to trip them up was just magical. Or how about racing a swoop bike through Mos Eisley and taking on a swoop biker gang as you speed through town and out into the Tatooine desert, flying over Sarlacc pits. It truly was just a great love letter to Star Wars fans. However, it's the on-foot missions where the game shines the most for me. In the on-foot levels, you are in big and expansive levels. Take the first one for example, Echo Base. Here, you take Dash through the famous base in the moments during its evacuation after the Battle of Hoth had ended. And you go deep into the base in order to reach your ship and be able to take off and escape. In the base, you'll also have to battle an AT-ST on foot with nothing more than your blaster. But then, you get in your ship, the Outrider, and fly through an asteroid field, holding off TIE fighters and TIE bombers. Being able to swap from third-person view to actually being in the cockpit firing off your turrets was exhilarating, and it reminded me of a similar scene in the movie A New Hope. You'll also take a hover train ride through Ord Mantell in your search for IG-88, who serves as a challenging level boss in his own right. All the while, of course, the authentic Star Wars soundtrack and sound effects bring a level of authenticity that was unrivaled up until that point. And of course, who can forget Gal Spaceport? A huge and expansive level that takes place within a giant canyon and literally takes around a half hour or more to get through. I mean, this was possibly my favorite level in the game as it tested the gamer's mastery of their controls in 3D by having them walk through thin ledges and use platforming extensively. It also had a section where you fly across the entire canyon from platform to platform using the jetpack that you acquire halfway through the level. And of course, it all culminates with an iconic boss battle with everyone's favorite bounty hunter, Boba Fett. And as if beating him wasn't difficult enough, who else almost fainted when they realized that beating him on foot only results in him getting into his Slave One and using that ship to attack you? Just simply epic. It was levels and boss fights like this which blew my mind and really showed the leap we had just taken from 16-bit to 64-bit. Definitely one of the top 20, no doubt. The year was 1998. Nintendo faithful had grown weary in their anticipation for what is still today in some circles considered the greatest game of all time. Now, we can all agree that this moniker, the GOAT as it were, is a lofty one, an impossible one to put on just one game. However, we can also agree that this game is one that is always thrusted into the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. I don't think that even today a lot of people realize just how revolutionary and groundbreaking this title really was. After all, Zelda games had built quite a pedigree and legacy up until this point. Remember, we had just come off the heels of A Link to the Past in the previous generation, and with that game perfecting the overhead 2D Zelda formula, how would Nintendo outdo themselves bringing the fan favorite franchise into the third dimension? People were fearful. After all, the game had gone through some delays already, signaling that Nintendo may have been having development issues. But then, screenshots began to emerge on the pages of GamePro and EGM magazines, and what we beheld with our eyes made us salivate for the finished product. We were jonesing for real. Then November of 1998 came and the wait was over. Who else remembers the gravity of watching the Great Deku Tree pass away after completing the game's opening dungeon? Or taking your first steps out into Hyrule Field, gazing out at that open expanse and realizing this wasn't your SNES Zelda any longer. The first time you see the sunset and the moon rise and you realize that time actually passes in this game as it does in the world you actually exist in. There are countless moments of awe and wonder in this game. Seeing locations like Hyrule Castle Town in full 3D with actual villagers conducting their businesses and having interactions with themselves was a watershed moment in the franchise. Visiting places like Kakariko Village, Lon Lon Ranch, and Lake Hylia really communicated just how big this new world, this 3D Hyrule really was. The game has amazing dungeon design, with just the right difficulty and puzzle solving to not bore experts or scare away newbies. The pacing of the dungeons was done to perfection. The time travel element in the story shows us two different Hyrules, and the adventure to save it all was more than worth it. It is truly a paramount achievement in game design and creation. Remember that this game was what introduced the revolutionary lock-on system known as Z-targeting, which pretty much every 3D game utilizes to this very day. This was the first time we ever got Zelda in a lush, expansive, fleshed out world full of objectives to complete. The game shines in every department. Graphically, stunning. Great character design and models for the time. Musically, memorable and beloved. Themes like the Temple of Time and Saria Song are even hummed by Link in Tears of the Kingdom when you cook to this day. Story, timeless, still one of the best Zelda narratives ever. There really is no way in which this game lacks. And after I think about all the moments, all the memories, how many hours I spent playing this game, how I played it with friends in the room watching, and them, just like myself, being in awe and wonder at the spectacle that we were witnessing on the screen, there's just no way that this game is not in the top 20 greatest Nintendo 64 games of all time.